Welcome everybody to the first ever episode of the Information Innovation Podcast, where we talk about everything from information management strategy to the latest Microsoft innovations, the industry case studies, and everything around how to digitally transform your organization to not just survive but to thrive in the digital workspace. So if you're listening to this, chances are you probably use Office 365 in some capacity. And if you've been following the McTish blog, you've probably heard us talk a lot about how to control your information in SharePoint and OneDrive. But once you're able to control that information, the next logical step is to start thinking about the flow of that information. And that's all about how to automate manual, time-consuming processes, which is the topic of today's podcast. It's all about how to automate your organization using Office 365. And to give some insight into this, I've brought on our first ever guest, Rick Espin, one of our consultants here at McTish, who is our resident business process automation expert. Rick, how's it going, and how does it feel to be the first ever guest of the Information Innovation Podcast?
Mate, I'm thrilled. Great to be here. Great to have the lights on. Great to be on the camera. Great to be on the microphone. And excited to share some information with everybody.
All right, good to hear. Now, let's get stuck straight in. So the landscape of automation in Office 365 has changed over the past 5 to 6 years from, old tools like SharePoint Designer and InfoPath to the kind of Power Platform that we use today. So just talk to us a little bit about how that landscape has changed, where we were, and how it compares to where we are today.
Yeah, okay. So SharePoint Designer, even by the name of it, it's purely just for SharePoint. So moving into Office 365, moving into the Power Platform, it's now more about all of the apps within Office 365, which includes, your standard Word, PowerPoint, Excel, but then also including SharePoint. And with Flow, you can actually pull in external applications to move data around, to transform data, save data in a specific way, do something with your data that is originally stored in Office 365. So SharePoint Designer, as I said, purely just for SharePoint, and that was just for workflows. InfoPath was just for configuring forms that were visible in SharePoint. So generally what I do, if I was to go into an organization and they said, look, we use SharePoint Designer, we have a workflow on this document library, and a document is uploaded, it goes for approval, it goes to 3 different people, and then we publish it. Well, out of the box now, SharePoint will do that with their standard document libraries, which is great. If you want to add to that, you can use Flow, and I've found that Flow is really, really good for just people in your regular IT team. They don't need programming knowledge. So Microsoft has moved to they say no code or low code solution, which I would agree with. But when you start getting into, say, like custom connectors for on-premise or other cloud applications that they don't yet have connectors for, that's when you start to need to know programming.
Yep.
Did I answer the question?
Absolutely. That and a bit more.
Okay.
That and a bit more. So some of our users, our listeners rather, might be a little bit like me. Could you just give a general overview? Obviously, a lot of this conversation is going to be around Microsoft Flow, or as it's now known, based on the latest releases at the last Microsoft Ignite, it's now changed to Power Automate. But I think we'll just call it Flow today to make it easy.
Power Automate for the power user. Exactly.
And can you just give us a bit of an overview about what Microsoft Flow or Power Automate is and what it does?
In simple terms, Flow will allow you to have a trigger and to have an action and multiple actions after that.
Yep.
So a trigger can be a new document into a SharePoint library. It can be a new entry into a database, on-premise, off-premise, with additional connectors. It can be any range of things. It can be a button press on your mobile phone can actually trigger a flow. So there are those two pieces to it. So once a trigger has happened, that then starts the first action, and then you can have actions flowing on from that. So you also have all of your conditional
logic.
Conditional logic, thank you. Yeah, conditional logic built into it as well. So if yes, then do this. If no, then do this. Or it can be on any range of things. If the number is this, if a word is this, you can parse JSON with it. You can send it to go and look at certain fields within a SharePoint list, bring that data back.
Yeah, great. So, for people that aren't as familiar with Flow, probably its biggest competitor or the most similar tool that a lot of people are familiar with or aware of is Zapier. But of course, there are a couple of fundamental differences. I mean, in Microsoft Flow, you can make a lot more complicated work processes. And the other major difference is, of course, it integrates directly with your Office 365 apps. So
that's the biggest part of Flow,
yeah,
mate. Yeah,
it's all about working within Office 365.
Yeah, keep it all within the same environment. So because Office 365 offers so many applications, like the biggest draw card, Teams, because I think I saw Microsoft put out something, they have X amount of million users in Teams now, and Slack's...
It's over Slack by quite a bit. Slack's at about 10 million, and Teams is at, I think it was like 18 million or something. Don't quote me on that.
You've got my back on the numbers, that's good. But Slack's share price actually took a hit when that information came out. So to everybody listening, I would highly recommend get into Office 365 because it offers so much.
Absolutely.
And then you can do all of the add-on stuff with Flow and the Power Platform, Power Automate now. I need to get out of saying Flow. I need to start saying Power Automate.
Now, and the great thing about it too is that it comes as part of your license. If you're on a business license, if you're on an enterprise license, you don't have to pay a separate licensing fee to use it. It comes with it.
It is good to know you do get a certain number of Flow runs that you can use. So it sort of depends on the size of your business, but I know that you can buy Flow run packages as well. Yeah.
So what are some easy examples of some common repetitive tasks that you could use Flow to automate in an organization?
Back when I was working for Department of Education, there was a lot of requests for like a notifications flow. So that would be, there's a SharePoint list that lives in the school's site collection, and you would have the general admin staff post an announcement into that SharePoint list, and then the request was to have that notification emailed out to everybody that it is relevant to. So we would have multiple security groups, so we would have staff, students, and then the higher ups within the school, like the principal and stuff like that, and we would scope those notifications to that specific security group using Flow, Power Automate. Another common one that we see would be moving Outlook, your business Outlook calendar meetings and events into like a Gmail calendar, like a personal calendar, or vice versa from your Gmail to your Outlook calendar as well, just so that you can be on top of what you have to do during the day, and then with your Gmail you know what you're doing on the weekend, so it's all sort of rolled into one calendar. So I mean, that's another good part of Flow.
And that works with Microsoft Planner as well as another common way to do that. So, one of the most common manual processes that organizations have to deal with is paper forms. So, I have to, firstly find the form. If we're talking about a manual process, I have to locate where the form is. I might have to print it out. I might have to then sign it off. Then I've got to maybe scan it and then email it on to a manager for approval. They might have to email it on for further approval from a department. Then you've got the whole how to, track the compliance of that. How can that kind of process with paper forms be automated within the Office 365 space?
Well, firstly, I would get those paper forms into a digital workplace, mate. Like, that's the first thing. You want them digital so that we have version control, we can track changes on them, we can do e-signatures on them for a start. And I mean, all of the other benefits of being digital. So anywhere that you have a device with an internet connection, you can access those forms instead of the forms being locked away in some room where no one can see them, or it's sitting on a person's desk and we're waiting for her to do something, him or her to do something, and they're not here for a week. you just get that much more visibility over a form. So once you have the form in a digital workplace such as Office 365 and you wanted to do like an approval process, I would probably go and put the form into Microsoft Forms. So try and actually make the form with Microsoft Forms instead of just a standard SharePoint list entry, because you can then use Flow to pull all the data out of the form, put it into a SharePoint list. So a SharePoint list is probably going to be a little more complicated than what a general end user would want to see, but Microsoft Forms actually looks quite good, presents well. There's a fair amount of config that you can do with that to make it look how you want. You have the form, you would pull all of that data into the SharePoint list. Then in the background, you can transform the data any way you want. So you were talking about an approval process. We could pull that data out into an email. If they're still on email, we could post it into a Teams chat. We could pull it into a Word document. So with Flow, all of those options are possible. Depending on the business, you could probably use a Word template and then pre-fill fields within that template with the data that was captured in the initial form. Once it's in the Word document, we could then e-sign it to, we could send it to the CEO. He can e-signature, e-sign it. Or he can click an approve button within Flow, and that can then go on to the next person, which could be the director of the business. They can view that document, view that form, approve or deny on that if they're happy with it. And then once it is approved or denied, if it's denied, it goes back to the start, gets deleted, whatever you want to do with it. If it's approved, it can then be saved as a PDF if you like, and then put into a specific area where it needs to be held. You may have like a policy library or something like that. Really depends on the document that you're actually using or trying to automate.
And then how does that lead into then managing, say if you need to manage that document as a record using the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center, how does that automation work with that?
So once it's in a document library within SharePoint, security and compliance can take over. So I'm not well versed in security and compliance, but I know that we have labeling. So we can label the document as like different information security levels. So official, sensitive, top secret.
Sensitivity labels.
Everything in between. We can also apply a retention to entire document libraries, to sites, to the entire tenant as well. So that document will never be lost as long as one person within that tenant has access to the internet and remembers their login details.
Absolutely. So obviously, Flow or Power Automate, as it's now known, is part of that Power platform of Power Automate, PowerApps and PowerBi. And PowerApps is all about creating apps with as minimal coding as possible, not having to be necessarily a programmer. And PowerBi is all about communicating information in a visual way that a user can understand. So how does Microsoft Flow integrate with PowerApps and PowerBi?
So I generally think of PowerApps as sort of like a pretty face to generally a SharePoint document library. So where I've worked previously at the Sunshine Coast Council, we had a project for the ground staff, like the road maintenance fellas. Excuse me. The road maintenance fellas can go out and, using their Sunshine Coast Council phones, take a picture of like a pothole within PowerApps, and they can tag it with something. They can say it's on Burke Street. They can say it's a high priority, and it will automatically track the location, the latitude and longitude of where they were, who uploaded the document as well. So that was PowerApps as the pretty face for their mobile phone. They can press on PowerApps, open up the pothole register. that Power App would then flow using Power Automate all of that information into a SharePoint list where all of that information is saved, all that information was captured. And then from there, we did another flow, which would then email I can remember her name, it was Trisha. She was like she would assign jobs to all of the different road working guys. So that was all contained within Flow. And so that's how Flow can help with a PowerApps type thing. With Power BI, I can see Flow being used for pulling data out of, let's say, a database somewhere. You may have a cloud or on-premise database. So we can trigger a flow, let's say, every day at 1 o'clock in the morning, we trigger a flow, so that's your trigger. And then the action is to go and pull all of the data out of, let's say, a sales database. We then can push all of that data that we pull out of Flow, out of that database into Power BI. And Power BI can actually model that for you on the fly as well. So the next time that somebody logs in and has a look at Power BI, it's updated like daily.
Yep. Yeah, great. So a lot of people don't realize is that, within Microsoft Teams, you actually have a little plus button where you can add a tab on a channel, say, and then from there you can actually create an app using PowerApps directly within the Microsoft Teams interface.
Yeah.
What's the kind of use case scenario for where you would be doing that within Teams?
Well, it would very much depend on what the data is that you're trying to collect. So before I talked about Microsoft Forms, so that is a fairly minimalistic data entry platform, whereas PowerApps, you can do a lot more with it, but you will probably need to know a little bit of code. You will need to know a bit of programming logic, let's say. So with Forms, off the top of my head, you can capture like single line of text, multi-line of text, a date. You can have checkboxes. There's a couple other little things in there. There's a small amount of logic built into it. With PowerApps, if you wanted to link up multiple SharePoint lists and then actually show that data in one place, you can do that with PowerApps. Or if you wanted to push data into multiple lists as well, you could also do some of the transforming of the data within PowerApps as well, built into Microsoft Teams. Depends on how you want to access it.
Yeah.
So I suppose the beauty of it is once you have it in PowerApps, you can put it onto your phone. You can put it into Teams, which is on your laptop, on your phone again, on your desktop, tablet, anywhere you want to go.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it all works together really well. So, we've talked a lot about using Power Automate and using Flow and automating within the Office 365 space. But of course, a lot of businesses use, different applications, different repositories outside of Office 365. So, Microsoft Flow does come with a number of built-in connectors. I think off the top of my head, you've got maybe around 200 built-in connectors. But if someone's using an application outside of that's not one of the pre-built connectors in Microsoft Flow, how easy is it to create your own connector for an application that doesn't come with a built-in connector to work with Microsoft Flow?
I would say you do need programming knowledge to do it. Any sort of web-based programming knowledge would definitely cut it. You being our marketing guy that knows JavaScript, jQuery, CSS, I'm sure that...
I don't know a lot of those things, just for anyone listening, but yes, go on.
You would be able to do it. So one that I've played with at home actually was querying for Bitcoin prices, purely because I just wanted to try it out and just see how difficult it actually was. So you can find any number of online APIs, application programming interfaces, and you can get a list of functions that they support. So think of it like we have an API that when I ask it the Bitcoin price, it sends back just a number that it is 5 characters long, so 10,000, right? So within the back end of Flow, when you're creating a custom connector, you need to specify the public URL for that API, and then you define functions around that API. So one of the functions would be get Bitcoin price.
Yep.
So we have the URL, we then have like the name of the function, and then we need to handle the response that comes back from that as well.
Yep.
So from the specific one that I played with, it came back as a JSON file. And so then Flow handles that JSON file, does what's called parsing the JSON file. And so JSON file is basically just looks like a big block of code, but Flow can actually read it and pull out specific pieces of information between two tags.
Yep.
So the tags that come back would be /Bitcoin price, and then between the two tags, the actual price is there.
Yep.
So then from Flow, once we have that value, you can email it to someone, you can make it a notification on their phone. So in overall terms of difficulty in creating a custom connector within Power Automate Flow, I would say it's quite simple, but it also depends on the API that you're working with.
Yep.
So you could be working with like T1 finance, T1 property. That may become quite a bit more difficult. There would be a lot more functions to define. I purely did the Bitcoin one because it was easy, and I thought, oh, this would be interesting, have the daily notification on my phone or something like that. Yeah.
What is that Bitcoin price at right now? I think it's
Don't
crashed
ask me,
horribly.
mate. I don't want to know about it.
I don't know either.
It really hurts me.
So I'd be amiss to ask, obviously a lot of our listeners are probably in the records industry, and one of the big concerns when you're moving data from one location to another is the security of that data. So what security measures does Office 365 have in place when you're moving that data?
So Office 365 has data loss prevention policies. And if you specifically want to look at Power Automate, you can specify certain applications in terms of like two different groups. So there's the business data only group, and then there's no business data allowed group. So let's just take, for example, if I wanted to use Flow and SharePoint and Planner all in one, those are business data. Those would go into the business data only groups, and then anybody within the tenant with the correct permissions could use any of those three connectors as triggers or actions for flows. But then I could put everything else into the no business data allowed group, so that then I couldn't go and connect Dropbox and then actually leak data out into Dropbox. So when I was working at Department of Education, they were quite interested in actually getting Flow running within the tenant. And part of my job was to actually investigate the potential like security repercussions of implementing Flow and like to find the holes in it at the time. So we're talking probably 6, 7, 8 months ago now. So I found that Flow will allow you to do HTTP calls.
Yep.
And that's one way that somebody could offload data. And so when you're dealing with like the Department of Education, all of any records related to children are of the highest value.
Yep.
None of that stuff can get out. So we had to lock down Flow so that all the information was contained within Office 365.
Yep.
And so then the no business data was purely everything else that wasn't Office 365.
Yep.
Yeah. There is also options to restrict certain applications within Teams as well, if you do want to do Teams. And we talked about sensitivity labels before as well.
Yep.
So sensitivity labels in Office 365 can help you control your data.
Yep.
And that obviously links in with Intune as well. If you have like mobile devices that are for the company, for your organization, you can restrict which emails can be forwarded if they have a certain sensitivity on them. If documents can be downloaded on the phones as well, it really depends on the organization that you're working in. For us at McTish, it's not sensitive data like child records. It
no.
is purely chats between you and I, which are of the lowest of low values, mate.
Yes, they absolutely are.
We don't need to keep memes on board for 7 years or anything like that. So,
and there might be situations where you want to make some even more complex workflows than what Microsoft Flow has capabilities of. Could you talk a little bit about how Power Automate, how Flow integrates with Azure, particularly Azure Logic apps, to create more complex workflows? That's a bit of a hard one.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. The best I can do would be to give you an example of something that I've been around a little bit. So there's a couple of good guides on the internet actually for using Flow to run PowerShell on a local machine. So Azure actually acts as, I suppose, the API to run PowerShell on a network device that actually doesn't have direct connection to the internet. It would purely be running a flow either on a timer, on a trigger, when something happens, run it through Azure using certain credentials and client keys and all of that sort of stuff, and then trigger something that happens on a network device. We're getting quite complex, mate. So I don't know.
I know you've lost me, so you've probably lost. You've probably lost a whole bunch of our listeners, but that's quite all right. But there are capabilities there to do that sort of thing. So just to cap it off, to keep it relevant, like what would you say are the biggest benefits for organizations in implementing Flow, implementing Power Apps, and automating processes within their organization?
I would say, depending on your policies, you can empower your end user to actually go and create some of their own automated business processes. Yep. So generally our job at McTish is to go in and have a look at their business processes and then go, yes, we can move you from a paper-based life cycle into the digital workplaces. And then let's have a look at how we can pick up some optimizations when you're in that digital workplace. So that would be your approvals and stuff like that. But also, if you have those power users within your organization, every organization has a couple of power users. They can be empowered to actually go and create flows that are relevant to their business processes as well. So maybe they do need a little bit of help from IT departments or externally, but I really think that giving users that power can be quite beneficial to a lot of businesses.
Yeah, and you don't need to be a programmer, you don't need to be an expert to be able to do that.
For most of the stuff that I have talked about, something going into a SharePoint list and sending an email, easy.
Yep.
My mum, my dad could probably do that if they had enough time on their hands, and they're around 60 years old.
Okay,
with no real computer experience. Dad knows how to use eBay, so yeah.
All right, well, I think that covers everything for today. Thank you, Rick, for coming on. First ever episode. I appreciate all the insight. And to our listeners, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. The easiest way to do that is to just head on over to mctish.com.au/podcast, where you'll be able to find any episodes we publish, and there'll be a little subscribe button there so you can get email notifications whenever we release a new episode. So thank you everyone for listening, and stay tuned. We have some really interesting podcasts coming up, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you. See you later.